The capital, Kyiv, has seen heavy bombardment overnight.
This night will be very difficult, and the enemy will use all available forces to break the resistance of Ukrainians. This night we have to stand ground. The fate of Ukraine is being decided right now.
This is the scene in a city under siege, eerily quiet right now. American intelligence officials have confirmed that 2 Russian military transport planes have been shot down. And tens of thousands of refugees are fleeing the country. Good morning, thank you for joining us. Now, we understand that Kyiv has come under heavy fire overnight, although it has not fallen yet. The combat in the suburbs of Kyiv started at close to 4 a.m. It was the scene of very heavy fighting and shelling. Gunfire could be heard from the city's Maiden Square at 5:40 local time this morning. There are also reports of fighting raging on the streets of the city's northwest and in the east, and 5 explosions struck near a major power plant on Kyiv's eastern outskirts. Ukraine's military reported shooting down 2 Russian military transport planes, one of them carrying paratroopers near Vasilkiv. That's a city 25 miles south of Kyiv, and the other 50 miles south of the capital. Now, residents have been urged to seek shelter and to stay indoors as fighting has raged on. The country's president refused an American offer to evacuate, insisting he would stay. Well, this is the scene in the capital, Kyiv, this morning. We're going to be live there in Western Ukraine and Washington. But first, our correspondent Geraint Vincent has the latest developments.
Listen to the battle for Kyiv. This is Independence Square in the centre of the city, and through a long night it echoed with the sound of a people fighting for their country.
Сьогодні був тяжкий, але сміливий день.
At the start of it, Ukraine's president gave another TV address. We cannot lose our capital, said Volodymyr Zelensky, and he urged his people to stop the enemy wherever they can. The night is going to be extremely hard, he said, but there will be a morning. There was fierce fighting on the streets. The Ukrainian military says it's seen off several Russian attacks. What were peaceful neighbourhoods just a few days ago now are battlefields. Yesterday, Ukrainian infantrymen could be seen stocking up on ammunition in the central districts of Kyiv, and an ITV news team on the ground filmed with some of them as they took up and then fell back from positions on one of the bridges in the face of the Russian advance. Part of the Russian strategy here is now very clear: to take control of the Ukrainian capital and unseat the government. But that plan is not being executed as quickly or as easily as they would like. For a second day yesterday, they were still sending attack helicopters to join the battle to take a key airbase on the outskirts of the city. And this morning, Ukrainian forces claim to have shot down 2 Russian transport planes, which were bringing in airborne troops. In New York, late last night, a meeting of the UN Security Council failed to pass a resolution aimed at stopping the war because Russia vetoed it. But Ukraine's ambassador took the opportunity to respond to Vladimir Putin's appeal to the Ukrainian army to turn on their own government.
Your today's call of your president to the Ukrainian army to remove the government of Ukraine, are you crazy?
These satellite pictures from Ukraine's border with Romania show lines of traffic, Ukrainians fleeing the fighting. In Kyiv, those who can't leave or who have chosen to stay find shelter in the city's subway stations. This morning, they woke to a tweeted message from their president. Do not believe any fake news, said Mr. Zelensky. I am still here. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
We can go now live straight away to Kira Rudik, who's a member of parliament in Ukraine, also leader of the political party Golos, which is an opposition party. Good morning, Kira. When you see what your president is saying, when you see how strong his words are, how does that make you feel?
Oh, I'm proud of our president. I have been criticizing the hell out of him for the last 2.5 years, but right now he's really stepping out. And he's doing what the president should do. He's moving the country forward, and he tells Putin exactly where to go.
Kira, where are you right now? Give us a sense of your situation and what's happening around you.
So I'm right now in Kyiv, in the center of Kyiv, and I am with my resistance crew. We are armed, and there has been like a very hard night where there were lots of sirens and air force fighting, and so we had to go to the bomb shelter and back, to the bomb shelter and back, and we will spend the day today training and arranging the crew to be able to fire arms, and then we are going to see, it says that Russia right now actually reached out the 24-story building somewhere here nearby, so we'll go and see if we can help. But all in all, we are preparing for another hellish night where there will be more Russian soldiers on our streets, and then they will be packed in the plastic bags and returned back home.
Kira, I think what is so striking for those of us who are not in Ukraine at the moment is seeing and hearing and reading the defiance of the Ukrainian people. It is extraordinary. And I saw on Twitter a photograph that you posted of yourself with a Kalashnikov rifle saying, "I am ready to fight." And this isn't something that I had ever expected to see. It must feel extraordinary for you, doesn't it?
It does. If you have asked me 3 days ago, I would tell you I would never bear arms and that I would stay away from the weapons. However, once you wake up to the news that Putin declared war on your country, and once you bring children to the bomb shelter and start explaining to them like what the siren means and why you have to get down on the floor, you get so angry. You get so frustrated for the tyranny that is trying just to deny us Ukrainians the right to live. And so, yes, after that, I went to the police station, and we were given the Kalashnikov rifles. I have it here with me, and I'm training to use it, and I'm going to use it if I have to. And this is what most of Ukrainians do. We are getting ready to resist, and we are resisting. You have seen that Putin thought that he will take Ukraine in just one day. Well, watch that. He was not able to take any major city. There are 3,000 Russian soldiers that are down right now, and we will be fighting back as hard as possible, and we will not retreat, and we will show the world like what Ukrainian nation is capable of.
I don't think anyone could doubt the extraordinary courage, the bravery of the Ukrainian people, but practically speaking, do you believe you really can beat Russia? Surely their power is overwhelming, isn't it?
Absolutely, I believe absolutely that we are able to win, and I think not only by ourselves, though we understand that on our soil it's only Ukrainian soldiers that will fight. However, we expect that there will be more help and support from our Western partners, because we are not fighting only for Ukraine. We are being a shield to the whole Europe right now. Because if Ukraine fails, then like the Poland is next, or the Baltic countries are next. And right now, the change that is happening, it's not only about Ukraine and its people. It's about the new world order in terms of security, in terms of defense, in terms of asking questions. Is there any force in the world right now that can stop Putin? And you know, like till this last night, I thought that this force is United States, plus Britain, plus Germany, plus maybe France, etc., Turkey, Poland. But now I know that this force is us, Ukrainians. This is the force that can stop Putin, and we are doing it very well right now. And the goal would be to fight him back to Russia and further, a little bit more further, just to make it even for the children who are learning what the siren means and how to get down to the floor when they hear it.
Kira, what do you think about the support you're having from elsewhere in the world at the moment?
So
what is your assessment?
Yeah, well, we are, first of all, super grateful for everything that we have received. However, Putin has not started the war unexpectedly, right? He was like warning us for 6 months. And for 6 months, my party and I, Holos Party, we were saying, guys, you need to provide us with a no-fly zone over Ukraine. At least guarantees of no-fly zone. But it never happened. It was considered impossible. Well, we are very weak in terms of air force right now, and all the times that Russia is throwing their rockets at us, this is the time where we would need help to hit them while they haven't reached the target. And this is what we really do need right now. The sanctions are making Putin's life very painful, but they don't stop him. We have seen that. The force is what is stopping him, and we just need right now a chance for our troops to fight without being attacked from the air. And this is what we were asking NATO and Jens Stoltenberg, and I was really glad to hear that they will provide us with more additional weaponry, which is also good. Bring everything here. We will take it, and we will make it useful for Ukraine.
Kira, your determination is striking. It's remarkable, really. Tell me, do you feel afraid? Do you feel afraid in the dark moments in the night when you perhaps are lying awake and worrying? I mean, how do you feel?
Sometimes I do feel afraid, of course, but more than afraid, I do feel angry. I'm super angry. I'm so angry that right now I'm a woman. I have to bear arms and I have to fight the tyranny that just decided that they would take what is ours, that they would come and try to throw me away from my house, they would scare my family and then try to change the way that my country works. And when you're very angry, there is no place for the fear. Because okay, I will be afraid afterwards. Right now, I will have to get very strong, train, and make sure that we have all the supplies and that we will go fighting. In this story about bad guys and good guys, we definitely know that we are the good guys. And I hope and I believe that that the good guys always win. So this is what our plan is. To win, because guys.
Kira Roddick, we wish you good luck. We wish you safety, and hope to speak to you again before too long. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's go live to our Europe editor, James Mates, who's right in the centre of Kyiv. Morning, James. What's it been like overnight?
Very noisy. A lot of small arms fire, a lot of heavy artillery fire, the air raid siren going off for most of the night. There's a lull. It's much calmer now. It's a beautiful morning, but it's quite clear that the Russians, if they were trying to take the city last night, have failed. Although there's almost no one around, there are certainly not Russian troops on the streets in the centre of the city. It has been a remarkable defensive effort so far. 2 days in a row now, the Russians have tried to get into the centre of Kyiv. Both times they've been repulsed. The worry in many ways is what the Russians will do next if they continue to be frustrated, and will the fighting and the casualties spill into civilian areas. We've seen a major tower block be hit overnight. It's no word yet whether there are casualties there, but if there were people in that building, and they were probably in bunkers, most people have been taken to the bunkers or the metros or have fled the city altogether. But if there were people inside, there probably would have been casualties. We've seen what Russians, when they get frustrated with their inability to take a city, have done in the past. In Grozny in the 90s, the capital of Chechnya, in Aleppo in Syria more recently, and we've seen both those cities absolutely devastated by indirect fire, by artillery, by multiple rocket launch systems, and if it were to get to that, it would be a terrible, terrible tragedy. But if the Ukrainians are going to fight, like Kira Rudik and others, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them now have their own weapons. If they are going to fight, it may well be a very, very difficult battle for the Russians to come through an urban environment like this.
James, in the end, though, is there any real doubt that the Russians will prevail? Because, as you say, they have huge reserves of weaponry. In a sense, they've tried to do it one way. There is no limit to what they actually could deploy if they really decided they need to, right?
Logic says that they will probably win this in the end, but I absolutely don't necessarily believe logic. Different things happen in war. Much more is about discipline, about morale, about motivation, than just equipment or sheer numbers. And yes, there are a lot of Russian troops, 200,000 they talk about, but this is a country of 45 million people, and it's an enormous country. It's bigger than France, and the distances are huge, and no one thought that the resistance would be as solid as it has been. I mean, they haven't yet managed to take any major city, which, if you said that at the beginning, would have surprised people, because the Russian doctrine is for rapid incursions with heavy armour. And taking enemies by surprise, getting in behind them, surrounding them, and that hasn't worked. The defence so far has been solid. Now, I'm not going to come anywhere close to writing the Ukrainians off in terms of what they can do in the long term. They've shown what they can do here, and if they continue to have arms and equipment, then there's every chance that they can make life very, very difficult for the Russians. And of course, they don't have to win in terms of driving the Russians back out and across the borders. That won't be the Ukrainian aim. What they have to do is to bog the Russians down, to slow their progress, to inflict casualties, and to hope that opposition at home ultimately will stop what Putin's doing.
James, explain how the draft is working, because Ukrainian men are being prevented, aren't they, from leaving the country if they're trying to perhaps take their families elsewhere. And anyone between the ages of 18 and 65, is being told no, they must return and bear arms. How does that work? And is there total support for that amongst the people that you've spoken to?
Well, it's difficult to know, and frankly, it's difficult to speak to many people. I mean, you can get out and about a bit, but getting any sort of feel for what the population is thinking, or in these non-permissive circumstances, is difficult to do. You can't sort of behave as you normally would and speak to people freely in shops or in the metro or bus queues or wherever. Yes, what you say is right, that we are hearing that men under the age of 60, so between 18 and 60, are being told to go back and report to reserve units. Frankly, how much use it is taking a 58-year-old man who's with no recent military training or equipment and throwing him to the front line, I don't know. But it's not clear that that's what's happening. There are many other roles within the military that you can get people to do and liberate active service troops, as it were, to move towards the front line. And remember that they are covering this enormous front line. And if you think of Ukraine as a rectangle, then on the western left-hand edge is Poland, and that's secure. But on all other three sides of that rectangle, they are facing these advances with armour, with helicopters, with aircraft, and that's the extent of what they're trying to defend, as well, of course, as this thrust into their capital, which would be potentially a mortal blow if they were able to capture it.
James, I was watching your live on News at 10 last night, and you were talking about the immense length of the border that they need to actually defend, and you said it's inevitable that there will be gaps in that defence.
Yes, I mean, we know that a large part of the Russian force that's been assembled on the border still hasn't yet rolled into the country, and they will be able to punch holes or go round and find gaps in the Ukrainian defences, and it is quite likely that at some point difficult decisions will have to be taken to shorten those defensive lines, to pull back, to give up areas of their country in order to be able to defend the core. Now, when and if those decisions will need to be taken or will be taken, we'll see in the days ahead, but certainly military logic would suggest that there's a limit to how much you can defend if the Russians continue to pour these huge armoured columns that we've seen still in Belarus and still in Russia, still moving towards the border, and the sheer weight of those numbers may mean that the Ukrainians have to reassess what they can defend and where. But I mean, I'm not going to second guess them, and I'm not going to say that they are necessarily going to be pushed back. Far from it. But these are the sort of decisions that inevitably military commanders end up facing.
All right, James, we're going to be returning to you over the next couple of hours while we're on air, but for the moment, thank you very much, and obviously do keep safe. That was James Mates in the centre of Kyiv, and our correspondent Robert Moore is with me throughout the morning. What do you make of what you've heard so far, Robert?
Well, I think we need to recognise and brace ourselves for the fact that this isn't going to be over in hours or days or possibly even weeks. In other words, the fundamental problem we're going to have, in terms of Europe, is that we could have a grinding war lasting months, exposing the fault lines of sort of imperialist Russia's ambitions. So it may not be containable to Ukraine. You know, certainly the Baltics feel threatened, but so too do the Caucasus and potentially Central Asian republics. This is almost a proxy war for sort of democracy and autocracy. It's a tremendous threat, not just to Ukraine, but also to the credibility of the United Nations, of Europe, of NATO as well. So, all of the strategic underpinnings that we almost took for granted in Europe are under threat at the moment. And I think, that is the danger, that, although we're rightly focusing, exclusively on the battle for Ukrainian cities, the actual battle is much graver and actually much bigger. It's kind of almost a global battle for supremacy, of which, ideology is democracy or is autocracy going to win? And that's why, the Ukrainians, I think, rightly see the stakes as simply enormous.
Is it inevitable, do you think, that this will spread? The great fear, of course, is if Putin sets foot in NATO territory, then things could escalate, and would absolutely escalate very, very quickly, because NATO is committed to defending all of its member states, isn't it?
Well, the great fear in Europe always, for centuries, is contagion. That, things can lead to unexpected outcomes, alliances are challenged, other actors become involved. This is a conflict being watched, intensely, not only in European capitals, but in Beijing, in Damascus, in Pyongyang. This is seen as a kind of intriguing and potentially formative battle of the 21st century, in which an autocrat is trying to take over, a sovereign state, and doing so with ruthless military power. And we saw that before. Remember, Mary, that Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000 on the back of the Second Chechen War, which James alluded to there, in which Grozny was almost leveled by kind of ruthless Russian military tactics. And he intervened in Syria as well. So, there is an imperialist sort of instinct now in the Kremlin that I think is, gravely worrying for Europe, which is why, NATO has stepped forward and said, not an inch of NATO territory will be imperiled without a bigger fight. But what sort of fight would that be against, a sort of a Russia that is hyper-aggressive and where we don't understand the kind of actions or the rationality of decision-making in the Kremlin? So, this weekend, is very unsettling. It's very worrying about what lies ahead.
You say the word rationality. Is Putin rational?
Well, this is, I think, one of the most fascinating aspects of what has emerged over the last week, is the absolute assumption of Western leaders as they looked at Moscow, is that Vladimir Putin is ruthless, he's deeply cynical and manipulative, but yes, he is a rational actor. And now that assumption is absolutely in doubt. So, there is genuine fear that we no longer have a read of him. We can't understand what the Kremlin is doing, and there is a sense coming out of this that maybe we are actually confronting a leader who is paranoid, who is no longer sort of in charge of events and doesn't understand the sort of flow of information, may not even understand the level of resistance that the Ukrainians are showing. There's a long history. I wrote a book about a Russian submarine disaster in the year 2000. When he came to power, there's a long history of Vladimir Putin not receiving bad news. And I wonder
this
if...
is the Kursk, isn't it?
Exactly.
I remember it well, yeah.
And, in that disaster, the formative crisis of his presidency, he did not receive bad information. People were scared to pass up information to him because of his reputation as a former, KGB and FSB chief. And it may be the case now that he's isolated in the Kremlin. The truth is, we don't know. But that lack of certainty is one of the sort of grave concerns as Western leaders try and judge what might he do next. Because even though this is a tremendous crisis we face this weekend in terms of European security, we don't know if it's going to get still worse and whether it may indeed spread.
You mentioned, we were talking about whether he's rational and paranoid and so on. I think there was some really mesmerising bits of television over the last couple of weeks. The speech where he sort of said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy for his country. When we saw his head of intelligence was stammering and trying to contradict him but feeling unable to, and rambling speeches that didn't seem to make a lot of sense if you were not part of his inner circle.
Exactly. And then we had, just 24 hours ago, this kind of bizarre apocalyptic threat, apparently alluding to sort of the use of nuclear weapons if, there was some sort of Western military intervention. So, this concern about his state of mind, I think, is going to grow over the coming days. And, that is why the Baltics, it has reason to worry. It's why those in the Caucasus, in Georgia, for example, have reason to worry. It's why Central Asian republics are watching it. Nobody understands, I don't think, the state of mind of the single man driving this military campaign.
Oh, Robert, you're with me all morning for as long as we're on air, and you're going to be also offering opinions and getting involved with some of the interviews we've got lined up. And I really look forward to those. There's lots to unpack here, I think.
It's an extraordinary sort of array of strategic challenges and of sort of tactical issues on the ground in Ukrainian cities right now. So a tremendous amount to talk about.
Yeah, a huge amount for the moment, Robert. Thank you. The United Nations Security Council has been meeting overnight where China abstained from voting on a draft resolution telling Moscow to stop attacking Ukraine and withdraw all troops immediately. So China abstained from that. Now, not surprisingly, Russia vetoed it. The remaining 11 council members voted in favour. And our US correspondent Emma Murphy is in Washington for us this morning. Emma, the countries which abstained might surprise some people.
Yes, indeed, and China probably the most of those. In a time when there haven't been very many wins for the United Nations, those who were part of this attempt to pass a resolution last night do see this as some kind of small victory. It came at great cost and after an awful lot of work, though. The meeting was meant to have started mid-afternoon and it was delayed by hours and hours as the political arm twisting got underway behind the scenes. There was a real hope that in putting this resolution to the chamber, there could be an effort to try and publicly isolate Russia. And that was why it was so important that China did not vote along with Russia and veto completely the resolution that had been put forward. But the watering down that went on of the wording was really quite significant. Those I spoke to yesterday morning were telling me that they wanted to put a motion to the floor that completely deplored Russia's actions in Ukraine. They wanted to personally criticise President Putin. By the time the wording was actually put to the vote, it had been dropped from them deploring the actions in Ukraine to just condemning them, and also any reference to the president had been taken out. But even so, there was relief that one way or the other, at a time when China and Russia say that they have this blossoming relationship where they have a no-limits partnership, the limits of that partnership were tested and were publicly done so, which meant that Russia, at least in that moment, in that chamber, did seem to be publicly isolated. This was the response from the US's ambassador to the United Nations after that vote.
Russia has abused its power today to veto our strong resolution, but Russia cannot veto our words. And as I said in the Council, Russia cannot veto the Ukrainian people. Russia cannot veto their own people protesting this war in the streets, and Russia cannot veto the UN Charter. Russia cannot and will not veto accountability.
And unusually for the United Nations, somewhere that is normally such a very sombre and sober place, there was a moment's silence requested by the Ukrainian representative, followed by applause in support of those in Ukraine seeking a path to peace.
All right. Emma, for the moment, thank you very much. And moving on now, we can speak to our correspondent Richard Gaisford, who is in western Ukraine. Now, you were in Kyiv, weren't you, Richard, until yesterday? So what prompted you to move, and what's happening where you are now?
We took a decision yesterday after our Good Morning Britain broadcast, Mary, that the situation was changing rapidly, and we wanted to be in a position where we could move a little more freely within Ukraine to show what was happening, which is why we came here to Melnitsky. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit more about this place in just a minute, but the journey here is really illustrative of the wider problems that this country is facing. Firstly, the lack of fuel. So many of the petrol stations have run dry. Those that have it have large queues. So if you want to get out of an area where the Russians are moving into, getting the fuel to make that journey is the first hurdle. And then once you have the petrol in the tank, actually getting anywhere on the roads is hard because of that Russian activity, and because the Ukrainians have blown up so many bridges to stop the tanks from coming into Kyiv. What you're now seeing is a smaller number of roads with a much larger number of vehicles. So the journey to this place should ordinarily take maybe 5 hours. It ended up taking 3 times that, and it was very slow going along the way. And one of the reasons it was slow was because of the army checkpoints that have been put in place along the road, machine gun positions at the side of the road. People are very twitchy, they are very nervous here, and we are feeling that here in this city this morning. Now, what I really want to show you, and I can't, is what's happening just to the side of the camera here. It is a volunteer sign-up station, and it has got sandbags out the front, an awful lot of armed men, but also a huge queue of volunteers going in to sign up to fight. There is huge patriotism and huge passion in this country for this country. You can see the flags lining the street, but also these faces here in the city centre. Now, in this section of the city, all of these faces are of those young people who have died in the Donbass fighting Russian separatists since 2014, and it is a very sad scene because there are young faces after young face after young face right the way down this main street here in the centre. We know that this area at the moment feels comparatively safe, but it does have a military presence as well. There's an airfield just outside of here that the Ukrainians Air Force uses for flying drones. That was targeted yesterday. The cruise missiles coming in to destroy that airfield. And before I leave you, Mary, I just want to show you this. This is the cinema here in Melnitsky. Now it is a refugee centre, and over the coming days that is going to become an increasingly busy place because there are thousands of people. We saw them yesterday on the roads, flooding out of areas like Kyiv, coming up from areas in the south, desperately looking for somewhere safe, and this will be their first port of call.
All right, Richard Gaisford in western Ukraine for the moment. Thank you. And we're on air with an ITV News special programme with the latest developments from Ukraine. Fighting has taken place in the streets of Kyiv overnight. Russian soldiers launched an attack on the city at around 4 a.m. An apartment building was struck by a Russian missile in the early hours. The violence has made its way to the centre of the city, and here you can see the aftermath of this morning's attacks. And I'm joined now by the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on ITV this morning, Mr. Heappey. What do you make of the pictures that you've just seen?
Well, I think that they are very disturbing, but at the same time, we have to reflect that they are not the pictures that the Kremlin was expecting to see this Saturday morning. Their day one objectives, and we're now into day three, of Kyiv, Kherson, Chernihiv, Mariupol, Sumy, and Melitopol are still all in Ukrainian hands. The fighting that you've reported in Kyiv overnight is very isolated pockets of Russian special forces, Spetsnaz, and paratroopers. The main armoured columns that were supposed to have encircled Kyiv by now are still a long way north. That is testament to the heroism with which the Ukrainian armed forces have resisted the Russian advance. And I think in the Kremlin, they will be reflecting that there was far too much hubris in their plan, and it is definitely not going as they expected.
Yes, but it's not over yet, is it, by any stretch of the imagination?
No.
Where are we with sanctions, Mr. Heapy, this morning, and any other action against Russia?
Well, first of all, we have been training and helping to prepare the Ukrainian armed forces for many years. A few weeks ago, we provided them with lethal aid, and those anti-tank missiles, we understand anecdotally, have already been put to good effect in the repelling of the Russian advances. Yesterday, the Secretary of State, Ben Wallace, convened a donor conference of 25 other nations, many of whom agreed to provide lethal aid. The rest have agreed to provide humanitarian aid. And we will coordinate with them now to make sure that that is delivered into the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. So that's the kind of urgent part of what's going on to help the Ukrainians to continue with this incredible fight that they're putting up. You're absolutely right that the kind of wider piece to impose cost on Russia is through sanctions. The UK is working hard to persuade other countries to come with us in removing Russia from the SWIFT system, and a number of prominent individuals and banks have already been sanctioned, and as the Foreign Secretary has said, the plan is to do more. It's just unfortunate that these things are prone to legal challenge, and so as ridiculous as it will sound to many of your viewers, we need to just get that detail right before we impose sanctions.
Mr. Heapy, on that, can you clear something up for me? Because I've been reading quite a lot of activity about this. Now, Liz Truss said that there are delays in imposing sanctions against some of these oligarchs because British city law firms are representing them and objecting to them and delaying them. Now, there has been a lot of response to that from lawyers themselves, ex-city lawyers, ex-government lawyers, saying that is nonsense. Only a court order can prevent that happening. So what is the truth of this? Because there's clearly some confusion at the very least.
So it's my understanding that these very prominent, very wealthy individuals have at their disposal, as you would imagine, very expensive legal teams. And unsurprisingly, they would seek to challenge any sanction that was imposed on them through the courts if they disagreed with it. And one would imagine that they will disagree with it. And that means that the government has to have done the appropriate due diligence on the sanctions before they are imposed. Yeah. But they will be imposed. People should be in no doubt about that. And I think if we had done it the other way, if we had imposed all these sanctions and then they'd all been unpicked by the courts thereafter, you would rightly be asking me very difficult questions about why we didn't get the detail right in the first place. So I think we're doing it the right way round.
All right, I think that's clear. But talking difficult questions, I think quite a lot of ITV viewers would be asking, how is it that there is so much Russian money in this country? This isn't a surprise, is it? With the oligarchs have been coming here for years. They've been buying up high-end property. They have been investing. They have been donating to the Tory party. It's at times seemed quite cosy. Do you regret those links now, the playing tennis with oligarchs' wives that people could bid for at Tory fundraising dinners and so on? I mean, that was wrong, wasn't it, in retrospect?
Well, first of all, on the sort of political donations point, it is an important point to make that anybody who is registered to vote within the UK is entitled to make donations within our political system. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think if you are a part of our democracy. You should be able to participate in our democracy fully. To your wider point about the amount of Russian money that has been in the UK over the last decade or so, I think that it probably wasn't foreseeable 10 years ago that this is where we would be at right now, where there is a full-scale
we should have foreseen it, shouldn't we? We should have foreseen it. We could all see the sort of leader that Vladimir Putin is. He's been 22 years leading Russia. It has become murkier and murkier during those times. Have we been all played for fools, do you think? Has the government been blindsided by the money and the glamour and the influence?
No, I don't think that's language that I would use, obviously. I think that it is the case, however, that there have been far too many people close to Putin whose wealth is a product of their relationship with Putin, who have found it far too comfortable to be in the UK. And that is ending now. As a consequence of what President Putin has decided to do. And those wealthy Russians who find themselves no longer able to lead the life they wanted to lead in the UK should reflect that that is a consequence of Putin's decisions. And if they've got his mobile number, they might phone him up and express their displeasure. The fact is that they will all find it now far harder to enjoy the trappings of their wealth here in the UK, and actually, I hope, in all other Western countries too.
All right. But in the meantime, this continues in Ukraine. How optimistic are you that the Ukrainians can prevail and defend themselves?
Look, I think that it would be dangerous for me to suggest that that this could go one way or the other. What we're seeing is that over the last few weeks, the UK and the US have had incredibly accurate intelligence. The Secretary of State and I have been warning of this on media rounds for some time now, because we've been able to see the intelligence we've got. That allows us to judge the progress that the Russians are making against the plans that we've seen. They are clearly not making the progress that they hope for. The more that the Ukrainians successfully resist, the more I think that they will be emboldened. You've seen in your previous correspondence piece that people are rallying to the flag. There is every chance that President Putin has bitten off more than he can chew. We, like Ukraine's other allies in the West, will continue to support them in every way we reasonably can. But we have to be very clear-eyed around the size of the Russian force that is amassed against them. And, the most chilling thing of all was the rather fanatical language that President Putin has been using in his press conferences and speeches over the last few days. We should be very, very clear that what stands in front of Ukraine is every bit as hard as what we've seen over the last 3 days, and we just need to do everything we can to support them.
Mr. Hebe, just a final question from my colleague, Robert Moore.
Yeah, Robert Moore here in the studio. Mary and I have been talking about the sort of state of mind of Vladimir Putin. You've referenced quite rightly the sort of extremely accurate intelligence that you've been operating on so far. Do you have a judgment on whether you now regard Vladimir Putin as a rational actor? Do you have a read of him and have any sense of whether he's prepared to take the sort of tactics he used in the second Chechen war and literally destroy Ukrainian cities if necessary?
Well, I think that there is a fanaticism and a fervour in his language that is very concerning. I think that he's gone all in on this. He has put a huge proportion of the Russian armed forces into this campaign in Ukraine. And I'm very concerned that he's backed himself into a corner. However, he also, I think, needs to reflect that he has been extraordinarily badly advised. The plans that we saw, they defied military physics in the idea that you could take that number of cities in a single day and encircle the capital within 48 hours. That was just hubris. And I'm not sure what will be going on in the Kremlin right now, but it definitely is not going to plan. It's clearly concerning that Putin is using the language that he is using. But at the same time, if I were him, I'd be sacking an awful lot of people who have clearly given him awful advice. And it's clear that the Kremlin is not quite as good at making its decisions as it thinks it is.
Mr. Heapy, what's going to happen next, in your view?
I think you're just going to see more and more utterly brutal fighting. And, some of Russia and Ukraine's bravest and best are going to lose their lives because of Putin's hubris.
And of course, the other fallout from this is people leaving Ukraine. How welcoming are we going to be to migrants, refugees from Ukraine? Can you promise that they will find a safe haven here?
Well, it's not something that I can guarantee or promise live on your programme right now. It's something that I think the Home Secretary and colleagues around government will need to look at. We've got 1,000 troops on very, very high readiness to fly forward to Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, if those countries request it, so that we can support in the humanitarian effort there. How those refugees are then accommodated around Europe thereafter will be something we'll need to look at. But there are plans in place for immediate humanitarian relief as people cross the border if the UK is required. All
right. James Heapy, Armed Forces Minister, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, the US Department of Defense has confirmed that a Russian amphibious assault has been launched in Mariupol. That's a coastal city in Ukraine's southeast. And our correspondent Dan Rivers is in the east of the country in Dnipro. Dan, so we understand that the assault is happening in multiple regions while we're on air.
Yeah, so this is to the south of where we are, between the cities of Mariupol and Melitopol. We travelled down as far as we could yesterday near to Melitopol, to the front line, where the Ukrainians have got a lot of heavy armour, rocket launchers and tanks to try and hold them back. But clearly the US Department of Defence is suggesting that thousands of naval forces and Marines are coming ashore along that coastline, and clearly there's going to be overwhelming force moving up from the south very soon. Now the question is where they go from there. Are they going to push north to towns like Zaporizhzhia that we went to yesterday, which are on the Dnieper River? You'll remember the Dnieper sort of bisects the entire country and is strategically very important. There's a dam there that they may want to secure a crossing of that river. Or will they push further east to try and surround Mariupol and link up with those separatist areas? But clearly this is another front now that is opening up with some rapidity in the south of the country, and we're waiting now to see whether they will start targeting this city, for example, Dnipro. More than 1 million people here. Are they going to start hitting it with airstrikes? We've already had a couple of airstrikes a couple of days ago on the outskirts, taking out a radar at the airport, but nothing else since then. And there's a sort of slight oddness here, because there's sort of a degree of normal life carrying on here, while not that far away there is a very fierce battle going on.
As you say, a degree of normal life, and there's a woman just walked behind you in the back of that shot. Do you manage to speak to people, and if so, what do they say to you?
I think, look, everyone is very worried. We've seen this sort of evolution of people's feelings on this. I think people were slightly in denial that this was going to happen a week ago. People say, yeah, but look, we've been living with a threat of Russia for 8 years. They just didn't really think it was going to happen, and that was informed really by their own government sort of briefing that it's just sort of pouring cold water on these alarming US intelligence briefings, suggesting that a full invasion was going to take place. I think now that's all changed. People are really beginning to think about where they need to go, what they need to do. Where we're staying, suddenly there's a lot of men with guns that have turned up. Civil defence, territorial defence people. As we've heard in Kyiv, 18,000 weapons have been handed out to ordinary civilians. It's pretty much, if you're a young and able men or women, grab a gun and prepare to defend your homeland, unless you want to be living under Russian occupation.
And what about the practicalities of life, Dan? Are people able to get hold of food? Are they able to get cash still from cash points? Because that was beginning to strain, wasn't it, that system? Certainly we heard yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a lot of queues at cash points a couple of days ago when the initial news broke of the invasion. There was obviously a bit of panic going on. There was panic buying of fuel. I got the impression, we did a long drive yesterday south, and there was actually fuel. I think people are being limited to the amount they can take out of cash points, so that has limited the amount of sort of panic withdrawals of cash. But there's no doubt that people will be stockpiling now and be beginning to sort of think, you know, prepare for a long haul here. I mean, no one knows how long this will go on for, but I think, you know, the grim reality is we could be looking at months of this war going on, and people are beginning to realise that, I think, and make preparations accordingly.
OK. Dan Rivers, for the moment, in Dnipro, thank you. And let's return to Robert. Interesting discussion with Mr. Heapy, wasn't it, the Armed Forces Minister? What did you make of what he said?
Well, I think one of the intriguing aspects of this is the Americans and the British in particular have had remarkably good intelligence. You know, they were always warning us of the inevitability of a Russian military operation, and they also predicted the dimensions of it. And they never spoke about just an attack on the sort of pro-Moscow separatist regions. They always talked about a full-on assault on the capital as well. It raises, you know, questions we won't know for a generation of whether MI6 and the CIA have actually managed to penetrate the Kremlin and have a kind of an agent inside Putin's inner circle. But certainly, you know, Putin himself is a master of tradecraft. So it raises that question of what we know about Vladimir Putin's movements and decision making and how we know it. But that we will not know for some time because, of course, the Americans and the British will defend their sources to the end. But it does raise this question, you know, sanctions and diplomacy may be effective, you know, what we're seeing at the UN and in terms of sanctions, but they're slow, they're incremental. They're not going to help the beleaguered defenders of Ukrainian cities in the next few days or weeks. You know, this isolation of Russia, the cancellation of, you know, football tournaments, of the F1 race in Sochi, of taking Russia out of the Eurovision song contest, you know, lighting buildings in the colours of the Ukrainian flag. You know, these may make kind of Western countries feel good, but they're not going to change the kind of essential decision-making in the Kremlin. And I think everybody recognizes that. So there is a sense, I think, of kind of almost inevitability that, just as Dan was saying, this is going to be a grinding war, and that the residents in Ukraine will need to understand this isn't going to be over in days or weeks. You know, there's no prospect of an immediate sort of diplomatic initiative. You know, there's some talk overnight of Israel acting as an intermediary because Israel has strong relations both with Kyiv and with Moscow. But nevertheless, you know, it doesn't appear that the diplomacy is remotely on the cards at the moment.
It does seem that America and Britain, having said that we are not going to wage war, we're not going to go to war with Russia, then what is the imperative for Putin to hold back at all? Sanctions, as you say, aren't going to work against him. Ultimately, only force, surely, is what's going to stop him if he insists upon moving ever further west, as we were saying earlier on.
I mean, I think, you know, we have to be realistic. There is zero prospect of the United States, Britain or NATO as a Western alliance intervening militarily. I mean, that is not going to happen. We are not going to get into a shooting war with Russia. That looks far too like the beginnings of World War III. So that is not going to happen. So that's why we're reverting to sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and then also, you know, crucially for NATO, saying, look, you know, there is Article 5. Not an inch of NATO territory will be surrendered to Vladimir Putin. You know, that is the ultimate red line for Europe and for the NATO alliance, is saying, look, you know, not 1 inch of the Baltics, not 1 inch of Poland, and hoping that that message gets through loud and clear to the Kremlin.
Just to take a step further back at the moment, why is Putin doing this? Because we understand, we know, don't we? Because he said that he's harking back to what he sees as the glorious days of the Soviet Union. But why now? Is he trying to bolster faltering support at home? And we're going to come on in a moment to talking about the demonstrations in Moscow, because I'd really like to get your take on those. And there is opposition within Russia, but from his own people. But what is it that's motivating him to do this right now?
My view is that analysts need to be humble, actually, about this. We don't understand it. It is an absolute mystery why he has chosen to do this at this moment, because what he's done appears to be entirely counterproductive and counterintuitive. He's solidified NATO when it was actually pretty divided. He has united, Europe and the United States. He has absolutely, I think, undermined his position within Russia, because Russia, has a long history of getting involved in bloody wars and that having kind of ramifications at home. If we think that, and we've seen the pictures from St. Petersburg and from Moscow of demonstrators, brave demonstrators coming out onto the streets and opposing this war, imagine how that is going to be amplified when the coffins of Russian soldiers become home. It won't just be from sort of liberal opponents of Vladimir Putin. It'll be the mothers of the soldiers in the Russian army who will begin to protest, and that will ripple out across Russian society. So once again, why has Vladimir Putin created this kind of internal threat when it appeared he didn't have one before? Why has he acted in a way that has solidified the NATO alliance? So, there is much we don't understand. There's much that appears counterintuitive. And that is why, Mary, I think people are legitimately asking about whether Vladimir Putin can be considered a rational actor, whether he might be suffering from some kind of paranoia. This sounds kind of extreme, but it does seem legitimate in the context of just how bizarre the decision-making is in the Kremlin right now.
And to return to your point about the support or lack of it within the Russian people, the links between Russia and Ukraine are so deep, aren't they? The Russian people have relatives, they have friends, they have family in Ukraine. They don't want to be killing their brothers, as many of them have been saying.
I think that's a really kind of important point and somewhat underlooked, is that, there are profound cultural links between Ukraine and Russia, family links. So many people are intermarried between Ukraine and Russia. People take their holidays in Ukraine. They love that Black Sea coast. So there are these connections, and it makes what's happening, much more kind of visceral and shocking. This isn't the Chechen war in which you can say that there's an Islamist threat or that it's on our on our Caucasian borders and we're trying to contain a threat that could come into the Russian heartland. This isn't any of that. These are kind of Russia's brothers and sisters, cousins. And so it makes this, I think, deeply shocking, almost on a kind of emotional level for many Russians. And it is possible that Vladimir Putin has made an epic miscalculation, because there isn't enmity amongst the Russian people towards the Ukrainians. They may not buy into his narrative that, as he has put it, that the Ukrainians are neo-Nazis and drug addicts, as the phrase he used overnight. They actually see many Ukrainians as part of the broad sort of Slavic family. So it is possible that Vladimir Putin has made the miscalculation of his life, which explains once again why, this is so bizarre. It may be that he's undermined support at home and indeed ultimately may have imperiled his hold on power.
Yeah, it's a real gamble either way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lots more to discuss, and I'll come back to you in just a moment. But in the meantime, Anushka Astana is in Downing Street. Anushka, what struck you most about what the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey had to say on the programme a little bit earlier?
Well, the central point that they're making, and what Robert said as well, is that there is a very clear line here in what NATO allies are going to do. They are not, as Robert said, going to go in militarily. In fact, James Heappey, when he came to the House of Commons yesterday, said we should not and must not send troops on the ground. And so everything in the armoury beyond that is sending military equipment, which is what President Zelensky asked for when he spoke to Boris Johnson yesterday, but economic. And as we are seeing, sanctions at the moment are not making any difference. In part, that's because the Kremlin has built up a bit of a war chest and it's not going to hit it immediately. But it's also because economic sanctions aren't hurting very much, and a lot of countries want to go further. One thing that Boris Johnson called for twice yesterday is something that James Heappey mentioned in his interview with you, which is this desire for Russia to be kicked out of the SWIFT system. Now, that is an incredibly important platform platform through which banks communicate and transfer money. Russia uses it to raise money for oil and gas, and people believe that it would be very painful if they were kicked off. Now, last night, President Zelensky tweeted that he had spoken to President Macron in France and that France was now supporting the idea of Russia being removed from SWIFT. There are also noises from Germany, and people I've talked to in Downing Street this morning say they are encouraged by that. They believe that if Russia was kicked off that system, that it would have a big economic effect and start to hurt the country. But if it doesn't, if it isn't enough, as we've heard, they are not going to go further. They're not going to send troops there. It will be about providing military equipment.
Right. Anushka, for the moment, thank you. We are live on air with the ITV News special programme with the latest developments from Ukraine. Fighting has taken place on the streets of Kyiv overnight. Russian soldiers launched an attack on the city at around 4 a.m. An apartment building was struck by a Russian missile in the early hours of the morning. The violence has made its way to the centre of the city, and here you can see the aftermath of one of the morning's attacks.
Мов я закликаю складати зброю.
The country's president made a morning address reassuring his people that Ukraine won't be laying down arms. Volodymyr Zelensky said, "We will defend our country because our arms are our truth. Our truth is that it's our land, our country, our children, and we will defend all of this. That's it." Good morning. If you've just joined us, we're bringing you a special programme with the very latest on the situation in Ukraine. As you've just been hearing, there was heavy fighting in Kyiv in the early hours of this morning, where Russian troops fought Ukrainians on the streets of the capital city. 2 Russian planes are reported to have been shot down on the outskirts of Kyiv, and a power station has come under attack on the outskirts of the city. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to defend his country. Now, this is a scene in the capital Kyiv this morning. We're going to be live there in Poland and Russia, and our correspondent Robert Moore is here for analysis throughout the morning. But first, our correspondent Garant Vincent has the latest developments.
Kyiv this morning is a city bearing fresh scars of battle, and it has seen a fierce fight. The Ukrainian military says it repelled several Russian attacks during the night. Here, soldiers stepped through the remains of a Russian convoy. And on social media, a Ukrainian president in Kyiv, keen to dispel any fake news of his departure or demise. "I am here," said Volodymyr Zelensky. "We will not lay down our weapons. We will defend our country." The battle for Kyiv is being fought in the streets and in the neighbourhoods. Apartment buildings not safe from Russian missiles. A Ukrainian opposition MP is among those getting ready to join the fight. She spoke to us earlier this morning.
Sometimes I do feel afraid, of course, but more than afraid, I do feel angry. I'm super angry. I'm so angry that right now I am a woman. I have to bear arms and I have to fight the tyranny that just decided that they would take what is ours, that they would come and try to throw me away from my house, they would scare my family and then try to change the way that my country works. And when you're very angry, there is no place for the fear.
Yesterday, Ukrainian soldiers could be seen stocking up on ammunition in the central districts of Kyiv. Filmed with some of them as they took up and then fell back from positions on one of the bridges in the face of the Russian advance. Part of the Russian strategy here is now very clear: to take control of the Ukrainian capital and unseat the government. But that plan is not being executed as quickly or as easily as they would like. For a second day yesterday, they were still sending attack helicopters to join the battle to take a key airbase on the outskirts of the city. And this morning, Ukrainian forces claim to have shot down 2 Russian transport planes, which were bringing in airborne troops. In New York, late last night, a meeting of the UN Security Council failed to pass a resolution aimed at stopping the war because Russia vetoed it. But Ukraine's ambassador took the opportunity to respond to Vladimir Putin's appeal to the Ukrainian army to turn on their own government.
Your today's call of your president to the Ukrainian army to remove the government of Ukraine, are you crazy?
These satellite pictures from Ukraine's border with Romania show lines of traffic, Ukrainians fleeing the fighting. In Kyiv, those who can't leave or who have chosen to stay find shelter in the city's metro stations, beneath a city which, for the moment, is still free. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
Well, for the moment, it is still free, and we're going to return to James Mates in Kyiv in just a moment or two. But just in the meantime, Robert, I want to talk a little bit more about sanctions, and we have been discussing them as if they're just a one-way thing. But we know that the Russians are beginning to retaliate. We've blocked Aeroflot landing here. They're blocking British carriers going there. And also, the implications of those sanctions come the other way, don't they? Because Ukraine is a massive supplier of grain to Europe and the UK. And so if Russia does actually get Ukraine, there are implications, aren't there, for the whole of the rest of the world and Europe?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ripple effect on all of this. And, we have to recognise, and I think government ministers do recognise, and the international community has awareness that, imposing sanctions on a country like Russia is not pain-free. It's going to be felt at the petrol pumps here. The United States is well aware of that. But there are implications, beyond that, which many people haven't sort of contemplated. Ukraine has a huge agricultural sector. It's long been known, for the whole 20th century as the sort of breadbasket of Europe. So where does that grain go? It often goes to more impoverished countries in Africa and Asia. Now, they're going to see a food price spike at a time when already, budgets are under huge strain and economies are under huge strain because of the pandemic. So there is the intersection of forces here that is very disturbing for the kind of world economy. And that is one factor we have to recognise, that as we impose sanctions, it is going to hit us as well as Moscow.
It is going to have an impact on our Western lifestyles, almost whatever happens, isn't it?
I think that's true. And the other danger with sanctions imposed by sort of Western European countries is it drives Moscow closer to working and having a deeper economic relationship with China. So, I think strategists have to ponder whether we're actually driving Russia and China, our great kind of strategic foes, closer together. And then that raises all sorts of sort of broader questions about where China stands. Don't forget, this is the century in which we're meant to be pivoting to Asia and confronting and containing a ever more assertive and ascendant China. Suddenly we find ourselves dealing once more with these fault lines at the heart of Europe. And inevitably, decision makers in Washington, in London, in Brussels are going to be distracted from the rise of China, which is why I said the other day that, the winner of this desperately tragic war may not even be a party to it, namely Beijing, because they can see the United States and Europe now being ever more engrossed with the crisis in the heart of Europe, allowing China to continue to develop its kind of a ever more assertive foreign policy around Asia and Africa. So, there are implications. It's very difficult to get our hands around this weekend, but they're going to play out for years, even decades to come. This is a defining conflict because it involves all of these intersecting economic, political and foreign policy forces.
What do you make of the way the voting went in the UN? Russia obviously vetoed the motion. China abstained. At least they didn't also veto it. I suppose we could take that as a positive. The UAE and India also abstained. What should we take from that?
I think we have to take from that Russia broadly is deeply isolated, but also it has still power. Don't forget that Russia is a major arms supplier to New Delhi. That is a factor in why India was very keen not to alienate Moscow. And the UAE too, is an important voice for Russia in some forums. So, you know, it shows that Russia is not friendless, even now, despite its appalling military aggression in Ukraine. It still has, you know, some power. So even though, you know, Western Europe would love it to be entirely isolated, you know, Russian raw power, not Europe's soft power, but Russia's raw power is still a factor on this very complicated world stage.
And to return to your point about us all being enmeshed and the things of this actually spread much wider, and we are calling, aren't we, for our allies to impose more sanctions. The Germans are very reluctant to get involved in sanctions on power because, of course, they are very reliant. Europe is very reliant on Russian power, isn't it? Russian fuel, Russian resources. And so if the SWIFT, if Germany were to come in and support us and wanting to get Russia barred from the SWIFT system, that would have big implications.
Say that again.
That would have big implications for the way Germany and indeed the rest of Europe gets its power.
Exactly. I mean, that is certainly true. And the issue on terms of the SWIFT banking system is that, you know, Washington and London is absolutely determined to try and keep the kind of European alliance together, acting as one. So, you know, we're seeing an incredibly sort of collaborative effort. And so what Washington does not want to do is push Europe in a direction where, you know, Italy or France begin to say, well, actually, these sanctions are too extreme and they're beginning to hit us. So, you know, and they also want to keep something left in the sort of economic sanctions armory. I mean, suppose the Russians begin to attack Kyiv in a really kind of desperately brutal way, start leveling the city. What are we expected to do then? So there's always an attempt, I think, in Western capitals to keep some steps back so there is a response, an incremental response to everything that the Russians do.
Rob, will there be, at the moment, some diplomatic channel that remains open between the West and Russia?
Yes.
Or has that, yes,
no,
there will.
Always there is going to be dialogue through some intermediaries. You know, as I said, there was some suggestion it might be Israel, some suggestion it might be the Indians. You know, there will always be a way of getting a message to Moscow. You know, Russia, you know, for all of its ferocious and aggressive military activity in the last few days, you know, Russia is a vitally important country that stretches, you know, from Europe through to the Pacific Ocean. So it's a country in which, you know, there are always going to be diplomatic links. And so one of the intriguing questions, Mary, is whether the sanctions being imposed on Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and on Vladimir Putin are going to involve cancelling their sort of travel rights. And that's going to be a big question in terms of, do we need to have a dialogue with them in terms of a future peace conference?
All right, Robert, for the moment, thank you. And we're going to move on now because Julia Chapman is a reporter in Rostov-on-Don in Russia. Julia, thank you for joining us this morning. What are you seeing where you are?
Well, here on the Russian side of the border, things remain very calm. We are under a state of emergency in the Rostov region and in several neighboring regions as well. But that was introduced a week ago now when there was an influx of evacuees from eastern Ukraine ahead of the announcement that Russia was going to recognize these separatist breakaway republics as independent. There was a rush of people coming across the border into Russia, upwards of 100,000. But that trickle has in fact slowed in the last couple of days since Russia intervened militarily in Ukraine, carrying out these assaults not just in the Donbass region but across Ukraine, as we have already been hearing. They have closed the airport here in Rostov. They've closed a lot of other airports in southwest Russia as well. There has been a little bit of shelling coming into Russian territory from Ukrainian positions, according to Russian state media. In the Belgorod region, just north of where I am now, yesterday there were 7 houses hit by shelling, according to the region's governor. 3 people were injured, but there were no deaths reported. There has also been some shelling coming into the Rostov region where I am now, but that has mostly ceased since Russia intervened on Thursday.
All right. But Julia, have you managed to speak to many people, ordinary people on the streets? I'm just wondering what sense you're getting about whether they support this action or not.
it's a very mixed picture. It's incredibly difficult to gauge broadly how much support Russians have for these actions. They supported the government recognizing these regions of eastern Ukraine as independent. According to a state pollster, 73% of Russians agreed with that. What isn't clear is the extent to their support for an outright war with their neighbor. Most Russians that I've been speaking to say they don't want to see bloodshed, but there are also others that believe the government line that Ukraine is the aggressor. They agree with President Putin and the Russian state media when it tells them that there is a process of demilitarization, denazification, as the Russian government is saying. And they want to see regime change in Kyiv, many of them. They believe that those people in power were put there by an illegal coup in 2014, as President Putin says. But also, we're seeing a lot of anti-war protests as well. So certainly, it isn't clear the extent to which Russia has support for this activity.
All right. Julia Chapman in Rostov-on-Don in Russia. Thank you. Well, let's return straight now to James Mates in Kyiv. James, as we understand it, it's a quiet morning now after a very intense night there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of street fighting going on. You could hear it throughout the night, air raid sirens going on right through the early hours. But there is a lull now. It's a quiet and peaceful and, I have to say, rather beautiful, if chilly morning here in Kyiv. And all we can really tell with certainty until the picture clarifies exactly what happened last night, but what we can tell with certainty is that this city is still very firmly in the hands of the Ukrainian government.
So, James, what sense are you getting about what is going to be happening later on today? I mean, are there whispers that the Russians are going to intensify their bombardment?
There are fears, no one's getting any information on that obviously, but there are fears that Russian patience with an attempt to take Kyiv through a surgical thrust into the city centre is clearly not working. It's the second day they tried. They have seen, everyone's seen what the Russians have done in taking cities before in Grozny in Chechnya, which was leveled to the ground, and in Aleppo in Syria more recently, and everybody absolutely dreads that the Russians would start using the sort of indirect weapons of multiple launch rocket systems or heavy artillery or air bombardments against a city like this, a vast sprawling metropolis, 3 million people. It absolutely beggars belief what might happen here if they were to start doing that. We did see last night an apartment block was hit by a missile. Dramatic video of that happening and of the damage that it caused. One must assume, it just seemed to be a regular apartment block of no great significance. One must assume that this was a missile that was off course, but that shows exactly what can happen when you use weapons like that in civilian and built-up areas.
James, what sense are you getting of civilian casualties where you are?
We haven't heard anything about the casualties from last night yet. There have been upwards of 50 reported from the fighting overnight, the night before last and yesterday morning. And that's just in Kyiv. Obviously there's fighting going on in Kyiv as well, and in many other, around many other cities. What's significant is the Russians have not yet taken a major city in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been fighting in several of them. And that civilian casualties are being reported. Collating the numbers is difficult. There is so much uncertainty and so much misinformation as well in terms of that you have to be really careful reporting specific figures on the basis that they may be accurate. Both the casualty figures amongst civilians and those reported to have been suffered by the Ukrainian armed forces, by the Russian armed forces, every army in time of war, every government, even if they think they're giving honest and accurate figures, inevitably their losses get deflated, enemy losses get inflated, and we reporting this just have to be really careful about not giving too much credibility to claims and counterclaims.
All right, James, for the moment, thank you. And our Deputy Political Editor, Anushka Astana, is in Downing Street. Returning to you, Anushka, now, will there be renewed efforts on sanctions from the government today, do you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I know that Boris Johnson is going to continue to push to try to get Russia pushed off that SWIFT platform. You know, when you were speaking to James Heapy earlier, it's clear that there are two parts to the sanctions effort here. One is trying to sanction individuals, and on that, some experts I speak to think that we are behind the US and the EU. As you pointed out, Mary, we are not naming as many people because they say there are these legal hold-ups. They're being very careful about going through that process before they actually put names down. That means that, for example, you know, a number of members of the Russian parliament, the Duma, haven't yet been named as part of sanctions, although we know that they are coming. The other side of it is whether we can go further, whether we can force Russia off this banking system, which basically is how banks transfer money between each other. It would be very painful. We know that Germany has been reluctant. They think there would be retaliation. They think it could be very painful for their economy. But all the noises are moving in that direction. Boris Johnson raised it twice in the NATO meeting yesterday. Last night, a conversation between President Zelensky and President Macron of France seems to have gone positively in that way. The question is, if Russia is pushed off SWIFT, how much impact would it actually have? It certainly would hurt. Analysts think that. But it seems that Russia has been pushing down its private and public sector debt in recent months and building up somewhat of a war chest that will cushion it from economic impacts. The real pain obviously comes militarily, but on that, there are only moves to support Ukraine with military equipment, not actually with troops on the ground, and that makes it a very, very difficult situation. Boris Johnson has talked about trying to get Putin to fail diplomatically, which has clearly failed, politically, economically, in which we clearly need more firepower. He does say, and eventually militarily, but as Robert has pointed out, there is absolutely no talk of that meaning we actually send troops.
Anushka, you were listening to James Heapy earlier on, and I was asking him about Russian money in London, and you know, it's a murky issue, isn't it? Can anything more be done about that?
It's a very murky issue, and one that to some extent the Prime Minister does acknowledge. You know, he's talked about the rest of Europe reducing its links to Russian gas, and we know that there are some parts of Europe which get over half of their gas supplies from Russia. But the flip side of that is that we need to reduce our links to Russian dirty money. The evidence is that there is a lot of that in London. You know, the figures are huge. People call it Londongrad. And when sanctions experts talk about how to hurt Putin, it isn't simply by economic measures, for example, by pushing it off SWIFT. It's about hurting him politically, and that means hitting those oligarchs who are very close to him, and many of whom have these links to London. It's about making it a hostile place for that market. But it has for a long time been a market that has attracted Russian money with links to corruption and with links to the Kremlin.
Anushka, what is your take on this issue of whether it is possible to sanction those oligarchs? Because Liz Truss was saying that that is being delayed by city law firms who act on behalf of these oligarchs actually moving in to defend them, and others are saying no, it's impossible to delay that without a court order. What is the reality of that? What is the truth of it as you understand it?
Well, the truth of it is that other countries seem to be moving faster than us when it comes to individuals. The US and the EU have issued longer lists of individuals in Vladimir Putin's inner circle who have been sanctioned. Now, when I speak to sources in the Foreign Office about this, they want to make clear that those people are going to get sanctioned, that they are going through this process, and that they think that has to be done to make it legally watertight. You heard James Heapy saying earlier that if they didn't do it, they would worry about the impact afterwards and about it not being watertight. But yes, there is criticism that we are not going as quickly on that front than other countries. But equally, on the other side of this, Boris Johnson has pushed very hard for further sanctions, including of that SWIFT system.
All right. Anushka, for the moment, thank you. Now, thousands of people fleeing Ukraine have been seeking refuge in Poland over the border there, and our correspondent Lucy Watson is there. Lucy, what have you been seeing where you are?
Well, Mary, you join me in a town called Kyiv, which is about 50 miles away from Ukraine. And it is acting almost like as the next stop for refugees. They come in at the border towns, right at the border, on trains from mainly, as we saw last night, from the capital of Kyiv. And then they make another journey on to here. So in the next hour, we are expecting around 2 or 3 trains to come through here. And we're told they are special trains and they are just carrying women and children. Right, assembled behind me right now at the moment are just a few volunteer firefighters. They have brought supplies, there is water, there is food. Just a few moments ago, there was a whole host of people out here who have now gone inside the train station, ready to greet people when they come. The first train, I think, in the next hour. Now, what they are offering are beds in their own homes. They will have water for them. They will have drinks for them. This is an incredible act of solitude. People have just come here on a Saturday morning just to help these people, these very, very desperate people. Now, yesterday, we heard so many harrowing stories. We were right at the border last night. On the Ukrainian side, people are waiting for up to 6 to 12 hours once they reach the border to actually get across. Now, we saw reports of huge numbers of people waiting at almost like the gates, people who had to abandon their cars because they had run out of fuel. There was no access to toilets, no water or no food. Now, in Poland, there are 9 transit points, just like the ones we saw yesterday, set up for people to cross from Ukraine into this country. Now, the authorities are anticipating there could be around 1 to 4 million people making their way over here in the coming days. And the stories, the different tales of these families making the brave choice to leave their homeland, to leave their families behind, to come here frightened for their lives, quite frankly. Now, I saw a couple this morning just outside where we were staying, and it was a Ukrainian wife and her Dutch husband, and I spoke to them. The Dutch husband spoke very, very good English, and his wife was absolutely terrified. They made the journey yesterday. They got here late last night, and they have 2 small children, and what they were hoping to do was to get over to Holland today, but they just didn't know. They did have a bed last night, and I watched the mother dress up her children, put their hats, put their scarves on this morning, and armed them with colouring books. And this is the situation here right now. This is a situation that my children, those children, will learn about in their history books.
Lucy Watson on the border with Poland, thank you. Let's move on now and speak to the Labour MP Stepphan. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Kinnock, this morning. What do you think? Has this been a failure of Western foreign policy?
Well, I think over the years we've allowed Mr. Putin to go far too far. Let's not forget that he illegally annexed Crimea in 2014. So more could and should have been done to prevent him from doing what he's doing. But we are where we are now. And the key, I think, is to get weapons into Ukraine to respond positively and rapidly to every single one of the Ukrainian army's requests, and to be ready to tighten the sanctions on Mr. Putin and his cronies. We certainly support the Prime Minister's efforts to get the rest of the international community to expel Russia from the SWIFT system. So there's a lot more that could and should be done. We need to see some of these designations in terms of asset freezes happening far more quickly. It's frankly disgraceful that there are armies of lawyers and accountants in London who are trying to prevent this from happening, but they can't do it without a court order. So let's make sure that we get the government to push these designations through far more rapidly than is currently the case.
Are you ashamed, frankly, of the West's response?
Well, NATO is a defensive alliance, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So putting combat troops into NATO, into Ukraine, was not an option. It's not on the table. But what I think we have to send a very, very clear message is that the Baltic states and Poland and other of those frontline European states are member states of NATO. And if Mr. Putin so much as considers putting a single military boot on the ground in any of those countries, then Article 5 of the NATO treaty will be triggered, and that will have the consequences that we all know. And that has to be absolutely clearly stated. What we are seeing now is extremely brave resistance and stiff resistance from the Ukrainian forces. And it is absolutely clear that with 150,000 troops, Mr. Putin does not have the power to occupy Ukraine. He may be able to occupy perhaps 1 or 2 cities. He will then face a bloody and a dreadful insurgency, which he will lose. He has made a deep and damaging strategic mistake. It's very bad for Russia and for the Russian people. He will lose in the long term because it is absolutely clear that he will never be able to rule Ukraine, and he will face a terrible resistance. There will be hundreds and thousands of Russian men going home in body bags, and the Russian people, I think, in the long run, will not put up with that. So in the long run, Mr. Putin has made a terrible mistake here, and we have to make sure that he pays the price.
I'm just wondering, what would Labour have done differently? You're implying that the Tories haven't been tough enough to date. So what would you have done differently?
Well, I think if we go back in history to 2014 and the invasion of Crimea, there were a number of sanctions put in place then which weren't even properly implemented. Is it right that 4 years after the invasion of Ukraine, we were celebrating the FIFA World Cup in St. Petersburg? And in Russia, there's so many things that we could and should have done differently, particularly from 2014 onwards, where I think it was very clear to the world that Mr. Putin was trying to roll back the years and reinstate the Soviet Union, frankly, and those days are gone. So the much tougher sanctions, working much more closely with European allies to wean them off their over-reliance on Russian energy, oil and gas. And I think stopping the UK being so open to the dirty money that is washing through London, all of the reforms of Companies House that should have taken place, a register of beneficial overseas interests so we can see who's actually owning these companies, not gutting the National Crime Agency and preventing them from acting on fraud and against kleptocracy, the unexplained wealth orders. Why we only had 4 unexplained wealth orders since that was put in place since 2017. You have to ask the question, why is it that the Conservative government's been so slow on acting on Russia? Is it connected to the fact that they've received £4 million from people who have close connections to the Russian state, including the wife of a former finance minister under Vladimir Putin? So I think there's been a conflict of interest. I think the Conservative Party has taken money from Russia, and that's not been good for our national security or for our values. And Labour would have run that whole process in a very, very different way.
Just picking up on our last reporter, Lucy Watson, who's on the border with Poland, and she was talking about a flow of refugees already fleeing Ukraine. You're the shadow immigration minister, as I understand it. What should Britain's policy be in terms of giving safe haven to people who are escaping Ukraine?
So our understanding is that the vast majority of people who are coming to those bordering countries now, particularly Poland, but some of the others as well, they have no intention of going further. They want to stay as close as they can to Ukraine so that they can go back as soon as the Russian occupying forces have been defeated and expelled from their country. So the priority, I think, has to be on the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary reaching out to their counterparts in Poland and those other countries and asking very clearly what humanitarian assistance do they require? What support can Britain provide in terms of supporting the centres and the accommodation and the food and water and the basic necessities that those people are going to need? I think that has to be the top priority. And then I think looking at where we are in the UK, there are large numbers of Ukrainians already in the UK. We need to make sure that family reunion visas are expedited as rapidly as possible. And I think then once we've had that coordinated discussion with the governments of Poland and Romania and those other bordering countries, we can see what needs there might be for us to provide safe and legal routes for Ukrainians who do perhaps wish to move on from some of those countries, which we think will be in the small minority of cases. But we absolutely have to be ready to engage and to be welcoming on that basis. But as I say, the top priority is to support those governments of those bordering countries, because that's where the pressure is going to be in the short to medium term.
All right, Stephen Kinnock, thanks for your time this morning. Appreciate it. We're live on air with a special programme with the latest developments from Ukraine. Fighting has taken place on the streets of Kyiv overnight. Russian soldiers launched an attack on the city at around 4 a.m. An apartment building was struck by a Russian missile in the early hours. The extent of the casualties is still not known. The violence has made its way to the centre of the city. Here you can see the aftermath of the morning's attacks. And this morning, the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey told this programme the UK sanctions are already being felt and the plan is to implement more.
As a consequence of what President Putin has decided to do, and those wealthy Russians who find themselves no longer able to lead the life they wanted to lead in the UK, should reflect that that is a consequence of Putin's decisions.
Well, I'm joined now by Sir Kim Darroch, who served as the British ambassador to the United States and previously as National Security Advisor and UK Permanent Representative to the European Union. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Sir Kim. Now, the Ukrainians are asking for more support. Should we be helping them militarily?
I think we should be sending military equipment to them. A number of countries have joined us and the Americans and the Poles in doing that. And I think that is one of the things that President Zelensky asked for when he last spoke to the Prime Minister. So we should be doing that. We should be offering help to Poland with the humanitarian crisis they face with Ukrainian refugees coming across the border. I don't think we should be putting NATO troops onto Ukrainian soil, and I think there's no prospect of that happening.
Yeah. So what should be the consequences then, do you think, for Russia of its actions?
Look, the sanctions are really going to hurt the Russian economy. By the way, they're going to put up energy prices, cause market turbulence, so there'll be impact in the West as well. They're not really about deterrence, because we're past that now, and Putin is making his attempt to take Kyiv and the eastern part of the country. So sanctions now are about raising the cost for Russia of what is happening, and you'd hope making them think again, putting pressure on Putin from all the oligarchs who will suffer from sanctions to find a way out of this. And I think it's important and right to press for international action on SWIFT. But remember, some Central European countries and some Western European get a lot of energy from Russia. It'd be difficult to continue to do that if the Russians are out of the international financial system. And Western companies that sell to Russia will also have problems. So the SWIFT thing, though necessary, is not easy.
And there isn't universal support by any means within Europe for that, is there? The Germans don't want to support that, and the Italians are cautious too. So how can that be progressed?
Well, I mean, remember, for example, Mary, just to take the example of Hungary, Hungary gets half its energy supplies from Russia. And if Russia's out of the financial payment system, they can say, well, we're going to stop supplying you energy because you're not going to be able to pay us. So there are real problems for some of the European countries with this. Nevertheless, my own feeling is that given what we're seeing in Ukraine, particularly what we're seeing in Kyiv, then eventually countries will come round. But one shouldn't minimise the difficulties for them.
Yes, indeed. Sir Kim, do you think the West has been asleep at the wheel in a sense? I mean, President Putin's been in power for 22 years. It has been clear, arguably, the direction of travel for some time, although I don't think many people actually anticipated that he would do this. But have we just let him get away with too much for too long?
I think that's a very fair question, Mary, and I think we will need, but who knows when we see an end to these appalling scenes, at some point to really think about how we've handled this. Because as you say, with the the separatists in Georgia, who were encouraged by Putin and by Russia, with the annexation of Crimea, with the encouragement of the insurrection in eastern Ukraine. There's quite a long track record here. All that said, I thought your correspondent, Robert Moore, made a very strong point earlier when he said, this is such an irrational, random, and high-risk act by Putin that you really have to question whether he is acting rationally anymore. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing to do, and I think it may take a long time, but I think it will end badly for him.
Well, indeed, and I think Robert does have a couple of questions for you, actually.
Yeah, Kim, hi. We're old friends, I should add. I was going to ask you exactly that question. What is your judgment about that? I mean, we've always perceived him, Vladimir Putin, to be ruthless but rational. Do you feel that we're now having to confront the fact that, in the Kremlin, we have an irrational actor, somebody who we can no longer predict, and someone who the intelligence community may either underestimate or badly get wrong?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And as you say, ultimately, it's impossible to answer at the moment because we can't see inside his head. Look, he was a KGB operative who came up in the Soviet system and who is notorious for saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst day in world history. So we know where he's coming from. But you saw that extraordinary performance with his National Security Council a few days ago, in which his behavior looked, frankly, borderline unhinged. You saw that angry speech that he was making yesterday, and you've seen what is going on now. Whatever else was in Russian plans, you can guarantee that still fighting on the outskirts of Kyiv with the prospect, a terrible prospect of house-to-house fighting if they're going to take this city, and all the casualties on both sides that would cause, that can't have been the plan. So it's not going well for him. I think we'll have to watch closely whatever he says in public in the next few days to see just how he is taking it. But he hasn't looked very rational in the last few days.
Kim, what was your judgment about the performance at the UN? I mean, are you disappointed? Do you think Downing Street and the White House are disappointed that the UAE, India and China all abstained? I mean, China, I guess, not a surprise. Abstention often is its default position. But, the UAE and India in particular, I mean, not condemning this aggression?
I think China was predictable, Robert. But the Chinese have got themselves into a profoundly contradictory and embarrassing position by saying, on the one hand, they support the country's territorial integrity, which has been a principle of China's foreign policy like forever. But on the other hand, they recognize Russia's security interests. I mean, what do they mean by that? So they are absolutely stuck now in a position that is ludicrous. I think India, you'd expected more from India, really, and it is very disappointing they've done what they've done. I mean, they have a long relationship with Russia that they regard as special. But come on, look at what the Russians are doing now. UAE, I just don't know what they're thinking there. I mean, they have a close relationship with the United States. There are a lot of Western, military. There's a lot of Western military support for the UAE in the face of the threat they face from Iran. So I find that decision utterly baffling.
So, Kim, can I ask just one more question, which is, just give us a sense of what will be going on behind the scenes diplomatically right now?
Look, it's a good question, Mary, and of course I'm sitting outside now. I think that, first of all, between the Western allies, between Washington and London and Paris and Berlin, there will be a lot of contact, hourly contact about how things are going, about the prospect for imposing this new round of sanctions, action on SWIFT, all of this sort of stuff. So those telephone lines, those email lines will be hot and will be in constant use. There are ways, as Robert said earlier, always of getting messages through to Russia. My guess at the moment is they're waiting to see if Russia's going to move. I mean, things are not going that well for them, on the battlefield. So they're waiting to see, first of all, if there's any intelligence on what's going on inside the Kremlin. Though that's a real stretch. I have no idea whether we have any of that. And then they will be thinking about whether there are channels to Russia through which we can use or which they might activate to say, come on, think about a ceasefire. This isn't going well for you. It's going to get worse. Well, let's try and get back to diplomacy. But This is guesswork, and it may be that Putin, in his present mood, just going to stick with the military option, however badly it's going for him.
All right. Sir Kim Darroch, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Well, protests against the invasion have been taking place around the world. Ukrainians and Russians in major capitals have joined each other to protest together outside embassies. From Washington, our US correspondent Emma Murphy sent us this report.
Freedom is not free! Freedom is not free! Freedom is not free!
Their countries are at war.
Freedom is not free!
Yet 5,000 miles away, Ukrainians, Russians and Belarusians are united in desperation. Their frustration directed at some of the most powerful men in the world for their action and inaction.
You just can't imagine how scary it is to call your mom and hear how the planes are flying and hear her scared voice trying to be strong for you because you're her child. And we're here and we can't do anything about it. So all we want is just to the rest of the world to support us. It's our families.
For President Biden, we need much stronger sanctions. What we have right now, it's not enough. It doesn't scare him. We all can see he's not scared of all the sanctions, He knows what he's doing. We need full support.
For these Russians, the war is not fought for the honor of their flag, but the dishonor of their president.
I think that Putin is a war criminal, and this is a criminal against humanity, and I'm so sorry about that.
That Belarus has offered its land as a staging ground for Russian adventurism has brought shame for some.
We want stricter sanctions on the Belarusian regime as well as as Putin's regime, because they're basically one and the same at this point.
The frustration that nations aren't doing enough to support Ukraine is not just felt by activists.
There's something to be said.
Alexander Vindman is a former director on the White House's National Security Council.
I don't think we're doing enough either to support Ukraine or to warn off Russia and Russian belligerents. And this is going to shape the future, the geopolitical future for both our countries and for the European Union and Euro-Atlantic Alliance for years and maybe even for decades.
Donbass is Ukraine!
It will shape the future even more directly for those to whom Ukraine is home. Emma Murphy, ITV News, in the United States.
Well, let's go live straight away to Emma in Washington. Now, Emma, the UN Security Council met overnight. We've heard a lot, haven't we, about sanctions, but what other possible options do they have now to try to put an end to this crisis?
Well, the UN has been exposed this week, as it has indeed been exposed before, as being incredibly powerless, really, when it finds itself in this situation. An organisation that was built when countries were in ruins as a result of war in Europe back in 1945, has been left trying to find some way to prosper peace, but without any great progress. In terms of where the alliance can go from here, where the UN can go from here, well, it's very difficult to see exactly how they can really push this forward, because the sanctions that have been discussed were initially said to be a deterrent. That didn't work, although President Biden came out a few days ago and said, oh, no, we didn't actually expect them to really be a deterrent. We are using them in a punitive manner, and it's going to take a long period of time. So sanctions, yes, they will have an effect, but not immediately. There is the other issue, though, of whether or not there can be more lethal aid provided to Ukraine or more defence systems provided. I was speaking with the Ukrainian ambassador to the US yesterday, and there's no doubt the Ukrainians really do want to see more hardware sent through to them. Now, of course, it would have been easier if this had got in just a few weeks ago when there was a clearer path through Ukraine, but there is still a route to try and get these things into place. Things like the Patriot missile defence systems that will be able to help protect from attacks on the skies. Also, the issue of coastal defence protection. This is something that they are extremely concerned about, and they know that there is no chance of ever seeing Western boots on the ground there in Ukraine. But they do believe that there is more that can be done by these countries that are offering great support to try and at least offer them something that allows them to try to defend themselves. And of course they do want the sanctions packages to keep being increased, because they know that that will make a difference, but not immediately. It's just such a difficult position for the Ukrainians in this country that I was speaking to over the last few days. They really do value the support that they're getting from the West, but they believe that there is more that can be done. What they really want to see is people going in and trying to protect them directly, but they know that that is quite a misguided hope. As it is now, they can just hope for more talk in the UN and the hope that somehow they're able to get more weaponry and also defence systems on the ground in Ukraine so they can try and protect themselves.
OK, Emma Murphy for the time being in Washington, thank you. Well, now let's join Rohit Katru, who's on the streets of Kyiv. Rohit, give us a sense of what it's like there this morning.
Good morning, Mary. Approaching 11 a.m. here, and what a morning. I mean, bright blue skies. I mean, the winter chill has completely cleared. And yet, look around us, the streets are almost empty. This is one of the busiest roads in all of central Kyiv. It should be packed with people. However, people who live in this city, millions of people, are terrified. And by the way, you know, one of the interesting things to remember is that a week ago, most people in this city, you know, most of the people we were talking to last weekend were saying, you know, you guys, you Westerners, you're exaggerating this threat of invasion. And now, here we are right in the middle of this extraordinary assault by the Russian military. We think that the Russians are on the edge of town. We saw firsthand a firefight between Ukrainian and Russian forces actually just a few hundred meters from this spot. That quickly cleared. But we're hearing about incidents all over the city. I'm going to take you around, Mary, show you some of the stunning buildings around here. The foreign ministry is over in this direction, and crucially, the presidential palace is over there in that direction. And it is assumed that if the Russians get here, will be one location that they will be trying to target. And in between, we have these sort of impromptu bunkers, people huddling down. The metro station, where actually last night a baby was born, as people across this city converged, huddled together with blankets and with food rations to keep warm and to support each other through the night. And actually, down towards the presidential palace, we saw a message that was recorded by the president, who, you know, a few months ago, you know, here's someone who was a comedian, a TV presenter, an actor, who is now leading this country. I think in some foreign governments, he was sort of looked on a few months ago as almost a joke figure. Not today. He was offered evacuation to the United States. We're learning from some new reporting from the Associated Press. And what he said was, I need ammunition, I don't need a ride. And, you know, it's hard to judge some of these comments. It's hard to judge some of the things that we're hearing from the military here, because, of course, those words have an impact. And, of course, everyone wants to add, you know, good feelings to their side, to the troops on their side. But what we're hearing from Western governments, what we heard from a very senior British military source last night and from a Pentagon source, is that the sense is that the Russian attack is losing some momentum. Western governments are saying that they have been impressed by the resistance that the Ukrainian side have been putting up. But the reality is this, Mary. We heard of close to 200,000 troops around the borders of Ukraine a few days ago. And the assessment from governments like the UK's is that perhaps only a third of them are within the country already. So the Russian side has plenty in reserve, and everyone here knows this. some of the busy shops are down there. This is a major. In fact, let me show you this crossroads here. It's one of the busiest interchanges anywhere in Kyiv, and we've been watching over the last few days of the sort of streams of traffic going every single way. Well, today there is nothing. This is the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police here. This is where the police operation is being led from, and actually me and the team I'm with, as soon as the airstrikes started a couple of days ago, we were right here, and we saw 4, 5 a.m. officers rushing into the headquarters, panicked. They were absolutely shocked and stunned by what was going on. Look, we've got an Uber driver here. I think he's pretty much the only one. Only cab you can get around here, I think. And down this direction, down the hill, is the big metro station, the big subway where people are gathering and are treating as a focal point. And and really, Mary, there is so much anxiety here because everyone knows the possibilities, but the reality is that no one knows what's happening next. And, everyone knows that the next few hours will be crucial. It's eerily quiet here, but the quiet is very occasionally, and last night very often, interrupted by airstrikes. And there were periods of sustained bombardment, which we haven't heard yet overnight. The fighting perhaps just a few miles away, and everyone waiting to see what happens next.
Rohit, just operationally, I know that viewers are very curious to understand how you are reporting this story. How do you get around? How do you, as much as you can, ensure that you're safe? Because you were out with Ukrainian volunteers yesterday, right in the line of fire, weren't you? So how does it actually work?
How does it work? Well, we're obviously, our own safety is our priority, and we're well aware that we have to tell people the story back home. We are facing the same dangers as everyone else in terms of, for example, access to food. Very few shops are open. There are curfews, which are early. But we're following the same protocols as everyone else. So, an airstrike happens, and then we head into the bunker in the location where we're staying, and we find with us dozens of other journalists from around the world, shoulder to shoulder in precisely the same situation. And as you can see, we head out onto the streets. We're wearing our safety gear. If we hear an air raid siren, as often happens, or we hear the sound of explosions or fighting, we put on our helmets, and our entire team is doing precisely the same. So, operationally, it is difficult for us. However, we're all well aware that for us, it's very easy to leave at the moment. For 3 million people in the city, it really isn't.
All right, Rohit, thank you so much for that. Stay safe. And we're now joined by Alina Frolova, a former Deputy Ukrainian Defence Minister who's advising the Ukrainian Defence Ministry now. And Alina joins us from Kyiv. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We've just been speaking to our reporter on the streets of Kyiv. What is going on from your point of view?
Let's be correct. I'm not advising the Ministry of Defense for now. Ministry of Defense is doing their job well without any advisors, as well as armed forces. Referring what your journalist just said, that no one knows what would be next. I should tell we know what would be next. We will win this war, because all the Ukrainian population are absolutely sure about this. Yesterday, from all the UK channels, I got only one question: that will you stand one day more? I should tell you that you don't very good estimate what we can do and our capabilities. For the last only 2 days, Russia lost more than 3,000 people, and more than a huge number of techniques, 10 jets, and it would be more. So because we have very strong army, We have huge resilience of population. The population is now with weapon, which was issued. And I think it's like would be correct. We need to stop to call our president comedian, because this is the president who demonstrates a very right behavior in the threat of the enemy, which is threatening not Ukraine. He is threatening world order. And I wish you to have the presidents and the leaders of the countries like we have.
Mm. Of course, what Russia has over Ukraine is almost limitless supplies of weaponry, doesn't it? What do you want the rest of the world to do to help you?
First of all, I want the rest of the world start to be a little bit faster, because this is actually the situation which we were announcing a few months ago, and saying that NATO, please create some kind of storage on the border with Ukraine. So if the situation would be crucial, we won't lose any day for supply of the weapons. Nothing was done. In the Black Sea, there is no any NATO ship of non-Black Sea nations for now, starting from the January. And this is not normal situation that in usual years, there were always NATO ships in the Black Sea. And this is not a problem for NATO's Black Sea, not NATO ships to enter the Black Sea and stabilize the situation. Russians will never attack NATO, because they actually are quite fear of any power which prevails. I think for them it was like a great surprise that Ukraine can prevail, but we are prevailing on the battlefield now. We need more supply of weapons. We need more supply for territorial defense. This is like an individual defense, like helmets and all the other. We need supply of medical supplies now, which will assist us. Probably fuel. I don't know the exact capacity which we have now, but I expect it should be a case in the nearest. And yes, as I said, that you need to make a decision and finally come and do something in the Black Sea. Well, just entering will change the situation.
All right. Alina Frolova, thank you so much for talking to us this morning. We are on air with a special programme with the latest developments from Ukraine. Fighting has taken place on the streets of Kyiv overnight. Russian soldiers launched an attack on the city at around 4 a.m. An apartment building was struck by a Russian missile in the early hours. The extent of the casualties is still not known. The violence has made its way to the centre of the city, and here you can see the aftermath of the morning's attacks. Also this morning, the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey told this programme the UK's sanctions are already being felt and the plan is to implement more.
As a consequence of what President Putin has decided to do, and those wealthy Russians who find themselves no longer able to lead the life they wanted to lead in the UK should reflect that that is a consequence of Putin's decisions.
Good morning. We're here with the latest on the situation in Ukraine and at its borders after fighting broke out in Kyiv early this morning. Ukrainians have been defending the capital from Russian troops. Attacks have been made on an apartment building while a power station on the outskirts has come under attack. 2 Russian planes are thought to have been shot down on the outskirts of Kyiv. And this is the scene in the capital, Kyiv, this morning. We'll be live with our team there, and our correspondent Robert Moore is here for analysis. First, our correspondent Geraint Vincent has the latest.
Russia likes to say its operation in Ukraine is about protecting civilians. The missiles tell a different story. One slammed into a block of flats in Kyiv this morning. As the injured were being carried out, the city's mayor, a former world heavyweight boxing champion, posted a message on social media. Vitaly Klitschko urged people to stay calm and to stay in the shelters. The enemy, he said, will attack from the air. The fighting in the Ukrainian capital was fierce throughout last night. The country's military says they repelled several Russian attacks on the ground. Here, soldiers step through the remains of a Russian convoy. Also on social media this morning, the Ukrainian president in Kyiv, keen to dispel any fake news of his departure or demise. I am here, said Volodymyr Zelensky. We will not lay down our weapons, we will defend our country. As the battle for Kyiv is being fought in the streets and in the neighbourhoods, a Ukrainian opposition MP is among those who've taken up arms. Earlier this morning, she told us why.
I'm so angry that right now I am a woman. I have to bear arms and I have to fight the tyranny that just decided that they would take what is ours, that they would come and try to throw me away from my house, they would scare my family and then try to change the way that my country works. And when you're very angry, there is no place for the fear.
Yesterday, Ukrainian soldiers could be seen stocking up on ammunition in the central districts of Kyiv. Filmed with some of them as they took up and then fell back from positions on one of the bridges in the face of the Russian advance. Part of the Russian strategy here is now very clear: to take control of the Ukrainian capital and unseat the government. But that plan is not being executed as quickly or as easily as they would like. For a second day yesterday, they were still sending attack helicopters to join the battle to take a key airbase on the outskirts of the city. And this morning, Ukrainian forces claim to have shot down 2 Russian transport planes, which were bringing in airborne troops. In New York, late last night, a meeting of the UN Security Council failed to pass a resolution aimed at stopping the war because Russia vetoed it. But Ukraine's ambassador took the opportunity to respond to Vladimir Putin's appeal to the Ukrainian army to turn on their own government.
Your today's call of your president to the Ukrainian army to remove the government of Ukraine, are you crazy?
These satellite pictures from Ukraine's border with Romania show lines of traffic, Ukrainians fleeing the fighting. In Kyiv, those who can't leave or who have chosen to stay find shelter in the city's metro stations, beneath a city which, for the moment, is still free. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
Let's go straight away to James Mates, who's in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. James, when we spoke to you earlier, it was reasonably calm there. What's going on now?
There have been a few outbreaks of small arms fire that we've heard. Anything like last night. As Geraint says, the city is still free, and that is clearly the case this morning, that there is a lull in the fighting. It was the second night in which Russians have made a thrust towards the city centre, quite clearly part of their decapitation strategy, trying to capture the centre of the city, trying to capture or kill the government. The President, Zelensky, has made a video of himself walking around in the centre of the town. It's understood the Americans offered to help get him out of the capital yesterday, fearing for his safety and fearing for what would happen if he was captured or killed. He said, no, please don't send aircraft to get me out or troops to get me out, send ammunition to help us fight. So he is staying, and for the time being the city is resisting a very serious Russian effort to capture it.
And James, what is your plan for what you're going to be doing later today? What's going to be happening?
It depends on events very much so, and we are right in the centre of the city here. Some people have been leaving this morning. Some of the press who remained here. There aren't really all that many of us left. But for the time being, it seems secure where we are. There's a bunker under the hotel where we're broadcasting from, and we have all the protective equipment we can have, and security advisors here. And we certainly all feel that it is really important that whatever happens in this city is documented, and that that people are here to witness what happens and to let the world know what happens.
Indeed. James, look after yourself. Stay safe. Thank you. I'm joined now by Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, and he's in Edinburgh this morning. Mr. Davey, your thoughts on what we've seen and what we've heard overnight?
I think the scenes from Kyiv are just so shocking and appalling, and we have to salute the bravery of the Ukrainian people and their army. And I think the UK government, with our allies, has to dramatically increase the humanitarian response to help those refugees. And we have to go much further in isolating Russia and making it clear that it is now a rogue state. We have to totally isolate Russia and Putin.
What is your sense of how the government has dealt with this so far? Do you support what Boris Johnson has done?
I think it's really important that we all say together, cross-party, across all the Western countries, that we are united in our opposition to Putin and united in our support for the people of Ukraine. I do hope, however, the government will go further in a constructive cross-party way. I want them to be far, far tougher on Russia with sanctions, whether it's on the financial sector, on the commercial sector, or on the cultural sector. You know, it cannot be right that we're not going further on isolating Russia with the SWIFT financial system. We need to be really clear that British businesses should not be investing in Russian businesses and inadvertently, therefore, helping the Putin regime. And we need to make sure that cultural and sports ties are completely cut off. You can't be playing football with Russians or any other sporting or cultural events. The whole of Russia, Putin's Russia, must be completely and utterly isolated.
But we are enmeshed, aren't we? Russian companies hold big stakes in British companies. It's not a simple business, is it, to actually cut them off and exclude them? Has implications.
Well, you're right to say that there is that linkage. Liberal Democrats have called for a long time for dirty Russian money in the City of London to be expelled, and therefore the UK has to go further. Let us remember that our American colleagues just last week said that the UK government wasn't going far enough to tackle the money from Putin's cronies in London. And you're right to say that companies like BP and Shell have got large holdings in Russian oil and gas companies like Rosneft and Gazprom. Those have to be removed. It might be difficult, it might even be painful, but if it's the way that we can support the people of Ukraine and isolate Putin and the Russian state, that is exactly what we must do. And yes, it might be tricky, but we should do it, and we should do it now.
All right. Ed Davey, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats. And now thousands of people fleeing Ukraine have been seeking refuge in Poland and through the country's border with Hungary. Our correspondent Lucy Watson is there for us. Lucy, describe what you're seeing this morning.
Well, Mary, I am in Poland, about 50 miles from the border with Ukraine, at a station called Rzeszów, which is almost like the second stop from the border where people first come across. Now, inside the train station this morning, this is where a relief effort, volunteers are coordinating support to food, water, supplies here this morning. So I don't know if you can see just in the background, there's a little boy there. His name is Dmitry. He is 8 years of age. He came over from Lviv yesterday in Ukraine. He's a refugee. It took him hours to walk here, and his intention with his family is to make his way to Austria today. But in the meantime, he is helping to put aid into bags, sweets for other children who are expected to come in on trains in the next half an hour. Now, the first train from one of those border towns, if I just walk through here, as you can see, it's quite chaotic, it's quite busy. People are telephoning their own relatives to come and help. And many of these volunteers have just come here this morning to offer beds to offer food, just to offer their help. Some people have driven from Warsaw, which is some 5 hours away. Now, as I say, there are 2 trains, potentially 3 coming in, specifically this morning, with women and children on board from those border towns who've made it across from Ukraine and are now seeking refuge here in Poland or beyond. So many times through history, train stations have been these makeshift refugee centres, and this, it seems, is no different. Now, many of these trains, as I say, are going to be filled just with women and children, and that is because many of the men on board who first got on those trains are being taken off. They're being asked to go back and fight. And probably the most harrowing conversation experience that I've had in the last 24 hours since we arrived in Poland was just a few moments ago before you came to me, Mary, and we were speaking to a man from Ukraine and his 2 daughters, Darina and Sofia. Now, their plan right now is a volunteer is taking them to Warsaw. They made it here overnight. Their mum is a police officer in the capital, in Kyiv. He is taking his children now to Warsaw with a volunteer where they will be safe. Then he, their father, is going back to Ukraine tonight because he wants to fight. The level of solidarity here from the Polish people is extraordinary, but the level of bravery from Ukrainians is outstanding.
It is remarkable. Lucy, thank you. It is remarkable, isn't it, Robert? The resilience, the resolve of the Ukrainian people not to lie down and take this.
And this is day 3, Mary. You know, we could be in 3 weeks of war. We could be in 3 months. 3 months of warfare. This could be a grinding conflict in the heart of Europe for potentially for years. So this is going to test Ukraine's resilience, but it's also going to do something more. It's going to test NATO's resolve. It's going to test the fundamental foundations of the sort of security architecture that Europe has had in place since the end of the Second World War. So everyone is being tested, you know, the EU, the Transatlantic Alliance, NATO, and it is unclear. You know, we have to be humble about this of what we don't know. We don't know how this is going to play out. We don't know whether President Putin is going to try and, seize more territory, whether he might push further west in Ukraine, or whether he might be open in a few days' time to some sort of diplomatic initiative that might come out of nowhere. So it's really important to say what we don't know. This is a battle for the sort of soul of Europe, if you like, and these are dramatic days in which the outcome is not at all clear.
They certainly are, and always the risk that Russia will unleash greater forces, weapons and so on. You and I haven't talked yet about cyber warfare, have we? And that is something, cyber is something that Russia is very good at.
Yeah, this is an interesting aspect of this. You know, we tend to focus on what is visible, you know, the destruction, the cruise missiles, amphibious landings, tank convoys going through the streets of eastern Ukraine or coming in from the Russian borders. What will be one of the fascinating insights into this is going to be about cyber warfare. What is going on? Are GCHQ and the NSA in the United States, are they trying to either track or even to be proactive in taking down some Russian military systems? We don't know that yet, but cyber warfare, this is an incubator, if you like, of cyber warfare, and we will wait to see how it unfolds.
All right, we'll talk more about that in just a moment, but right now we're going to go back to Rohit Khatri, who's live on the streets of Kiev. Rohit, what are you seeing there this morning? What's going on?
Can you just tap well, I mean, the streets, as I said earlier, are almost totally silent. Attention is occasionally caught by, a race of military activity, a small group of soldiers. We just saw something over here. There's perhaps half a dozen soldiers there who appear to be detaining somebody. We don't know very much at all about the circumstances of what's happening here. What we do know is that all around us, all around this square, soldiers and police officers are incredibly wary. This is such a high-profile location, and so there's particular focus on this sort of 100-meter square area around us. And we know that one of the fears from the Ukrainian agencies has been both the threat posed by so-called Russian saboteurs, but also the possibility, as outlined in intelligence reports, that there might be people inside the government who actually back the Russians, who have actually been perhaps even working for the Russians. And that sort of trend has been going on since the end of the Cold War, frankly. We'll keep an eye on the situation over here. But, you know, the police and the authorities are incredibly wary. In fact, you know, just an hour ago, I was brought into a police office, this building right here. People were asking me what we are doing. They wanted to see our journalistic credentials and our accreditation. And even though I was wearing a big vest with press on, it really shows that people are worried. In fact, have a look down here, Kenny. I don't know if you can see that.
What's going on there, Rohit?
There's yeah, I don't know if you can see this. There's police and soldiers who appear to be, are they detaining someone too?
They look like that, yeah.
There we are. They're putting him inside the back of a police vehicle. Two armed officers, two soldiers who have been coming. I think that's in a southerly direction. You know, obviously suspicion is high. Tensions heightened too. And, you know, we're hearing many stories about people who are being rounded up, put in police stations, interrogated, but then released shortly afterwards. And so the simple sight of someone being thrown into the back of a police car is obviously no evidence of any wrongdoing. But I think what it is evidence of is the general mood, the general nature of everything we're seeing around here. In fact, the only people on the streets here on the busiest day, what should be the busiest day of the week, and that's air raid sirens. So this is a really familiar kind of pattern now where everyone has to, you know, people are pretty used to it now. These air sirens go off perhaps once an hour and everyone has to run for cover. Some people into the bunkers. Let's take cover under this shelter here outside this is the headquarters of the municipal council building, really, and the part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you can hear the air raid sirens too. It doesn't necessarily mean that
it does. I guess you don't know what's going to happen.
A convoy of police vehicles, I don't know if you can still hear me, Mary. A convoy of police vehicles just went shooting down from the police station where we just were, down this thoroughfare as the air raid sirens sound right above us. So, you know, there's a lot going on.
And this
on what
is
could be
on the streets, Rohit, of a modern European capital city, the capital of a democracy.
Yeah.
That's Ukraine.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we are at the heart of Ukrainian democracy. The parliament is not very far away. These are government buildings everywhere. These are the big hotel chains. You know, there's a Hyatt Regency there, an Intercontinental there. You know, this is more like London or Birmingham or Manchester or Glasgow than, you know, a city from a war zone, frankly. And that is part of what is so startling, so surprising about the events that we're seeing and the speed with which this was happening. I mean, we were walking down here 7 days ago, a Saturday night, the street was busy. People were heading, you know, I saw people heading into karaoke bars. I saw, you know, drunk groups stumbling out of restaurants, having, steak restaurants and you know, just doing normal things. And you know, frankly, this has been so sudden, and the suddenness is part of what's you know, really shocked so many people.
It is extraordinary. Rohit, I think we're going to leave you there so you can, so Rohit can get to safety with those sirens going off. And I have to say that at a time like that, I don't think karaoke would be top of my list of pastimes. But anyway, extraordinary. Let's go straight away to Tobias Ellwood, who's Conservative MP for Bournemouth East and Chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. Good morning, Mr. Ellwood. Thank you for joining us. Should the UK government be doing more to help the Ukrainian forces?
Well, we've been holding a donor conference, which I'm really pleased to encourage other NATO countries to lean into this and provide extra lethal weapon systems to the country. I was actually only in that square a week ago, and astonishing to see how events have moved so swiftly indeed. Ukraine is urgently in need of help. This is a European country under siege from another state, something we never thought we'd see in the 21st century. I think it's a reminder of how dangerous our world is becoming. And it's important that we react to Ukrainians' requests, particularly for anti-air systems, where they're going to be moving probably to an insurgency mode. This is a new phase, a dangerous phase of this crisis. And we've got to answer Ukrainian calls for help.
Yeah, indeed. Mr. Ellwood, you said none of us expected to see this, and even a week ago we were hoping it wouldn't happen. But have we missed a trick in a sense in the West? You know, we knew what Vladimir Putin was like. This is not a surprise in some senses, is it? Have we been taken for fools, do you think, by Russia?
Oh, completely. And we need to recognise that there are huge lessons to be learned in understanding the wider geopolitical picture that is now changing in front of us. I asked 6 months ago for a NATO division to move into Ukraine so we can actually defend democracy, not to start a war, but to prevent it. It's the one asset that Putin actually fears, and that's the formidable NATO alliance. But we actually declared publicly that we would not use them simply because Ukraine was not part of NATO. I remember serving in Bosnia. NATO wasn't part of Bosnia there, but there was a commitment to European security. And now we are playing catch up. We're actually reacting to events rather than getting ahead of them. And the big question is, when do you stand up to Putin? Do you, make sure that you hold him back today, or do you allow him to advance and end up having a bigger battle later on when you realize what his intentions are? Things won't stop here. Let's make this very, very clear. Putin's ideological intention to expand his sphere of influence will go way beyond Ukraine. So with a lot of head scratching for the West to do, to realize that we need to recognize what we believe in, what we stand for, and what we're willing to defend.
Mr. Ellwood, my colleague Robert Moore has a question for you. He's sitting beside me.
Yeah, it's clear, it's Robert Moore here in the studio. It's clear that we're not going to get engaged in a sort of military sense in Ukraine, not even in imposing a no-fly zone. What would your view be of whether we should engage in the shadows? For example, should we engage in cyber warfare against Russian forces who are on the ground in Ukraine or who are poised on the borders? What about cyber warfare as a sort of shadow option for GCHQ, for the NSA? Is that something you think is on the agenda, should be on the table?
It absolutely should. We should recognize that there is a massive amount of sub-threshold threat that Russia provides, and also don't distinguish between main military engagement. We seem to, as you're implying, segregate, conventional intervention versus cyber and so forth. Russia doesn't operate that anymore. Their doctrine, their protocols mixes all this together. The civilian and military attacks and so forth is all part of the same collective. The character of conflicts has changed, but our response to it has not. We're still fighting, if you like, in the same characteristics as we've done in previous wars. There are many ways that we can provide assistance to defend Ukraine and Ukraine's sovereignty, other than simply putting in boots on the ground. But I would go back and say, we need to reconsider this no-fly zone, let's say west of the Dnipro River, because that would change the optics here. Yes, we will be looking Putin in the eye and saying, are you going to ratchet this up? But I make it very, very clear, if we don't stand our ground now, where will this go? And don't forget, there are other adversaries around the world, namely China, watching very carefully how the West reacts here. And if we seem to be timid, if we seem to be risk averse, China will take full advantage of that weakness too.
All right. Tobias Ellwood, Chair of the Defence Select Committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's sobering stuff, isn't it, Robert?
And really interesting what he said about this sort of sub-threshold Western intervention. This is, fascinating, is whether we will get involved in sort of activities like cyber warfare against Russian forces to try and limit the visibility of, Russian pilots flying over Ukraine, or to try and interfere. So it does raise the question of whether things are going on behind the scenes that we do not currently have visibility about. But undoubtedly, I think what this program has kind of, coalesced is this sense that not only Ukraine is in this battle, but there is a sort of proxy war between democracy and autocracy, that lots of kind of malign actors around the world are watching very carefully to see how the NATO alliance, how the European Union, how Washington is reacting. There are real concerns going forward. If you went forward a couple of years, there is the possibility of an axis where we have President Xi in China, an emboldened president, and maybe an irrational President Putin in Moscow, and potentially the return of Donald Trump in Washington. So, it is feeling like the axis in the international community is at a kind of pivot point, and there are some very real strategic risks ahead. This is not the end of the story, as we've so often said. This is a beginning, not just of a battle for Ukraine, but a battle for the soul of European democracy.
We just have a minute or so left on the programme. I just want to get a final thought from you on President Biden's role within this. Is he up to it?
It's very difficult for him because he hasn't got a military option, as we have discussed. The diplomatic options have been tried and have failed. And so, we are now left kind of in, as we have talked about before, a sort of informational warfare in which everybody is trying to control the narrative. But, there's no question that Western leadership is being tested like never before. Not since 1945 have we had a sort of Central European challenge like this. And whether, European leaders are up for the challenge, I think, is very much to be seen over the coming weeks, months and years.
OK, Robert, thank you. I wish it was more positive, but sadly not at this stage. Thank you. And that brings us to an end of our special coverage of the war in Ukraine so far this morning. This is a scene in the capital live now. It is late morning in Kyiv. They're a couple of hours ahead of us. There was heavy fighting overnight, but it's been calm thus far this morning on the streets, as our reporters told us. As you can see, it is somewhat ironically a beautiful morning, the Ukrainian capital. Lovely blue skies there. Russian forces appear to have met with firm resistance from Ukrainian forces, and the city has not fallen. We'll be back at just before 20 to 1 with the lunchtime news. From us, for the time being, bye-bye.